Congrats on getting your new Aquarium Co-op sponge filter with the Easy Flow accessory. In order to put it all together, let's lay out all the parts on the table. Starting with the sponge filter, we've got the black sponge, a heavy weighted base so that it won't float away, two identical strainer pieces that go inside the sponge, a base connector that goes on the bottom of the strainer, and a bullseye that goes on top of the strainer. If you already owned our sponge filter and then separately bought the Easy Flow upgrade kit, then you're going to have an extra green uplift tube that came with the sponge filter, which you can put aside. As for the Easy Flow parts, we have 5 dark green connectors that stack up in this order. First, we have an air collar that produces small bubbles for better efficiency, so no need to add an air stone anymore. Then there is a wide connector with no airline tubing holder, so it looks like a large ring. Next is a wide connector with an airline tubing holder, so a large ring with some little pinchers on the side. Next is a small connector with no airline tubing holder, so it looks like a small ring. And finally, a small connector with an airline tubing holder on the side. Now, you may be confused which side is up or down on the connectors, and so each connector has a more rounded opening on one side. That is the side that would be facing upward. And then on the other side is a flat-edged opening, and that's the side that's going to face downward toward the sponge filter. We also have 5 translucent green tubes, 3 short and wide tubes, 1 tall and skinny tube, and 1 curved tube. Now to put everything together, we're going to first snap the 2 strainer pieces together. And then the base connector fits on the bottom of the strainer stack. So it will kind of look like an upside down hat. Then we will attach the weighted base to the bottom of the strainers. Slide the sponge over the strainers, and then snap the bullseye onto the top of the strainer. Now let's take the air collar from the Easy Flow kit and attach it to the bullseye on top of the sponge filter. Then we take one of the short, wide Easy Flow tubes and connect it to the air collar. Find the dark green wide connector with no airline tubing holder and attach it to the stack. And then add another short, wide tube on top of it. Next is the wide connector that does have an airline tubing holder on the side. Make sure the airline tubing holder is facing the same direction as the nipple of the air collar so that they will all line up. Add the last short wide tube and then connect the small connector with no airline tubing holder. Then we connect the long skinny tube, which, by the way, has the ability to slide up and down inside of the short wide tube if you want to adjust the height, but we'll talk about that later. The last connector is the small connector with an airline tubing holder, so make sure it faces the same direction as the other airline tubing holder and the air collar. Finally, we have the curved tube. As you can see, one side of the curved piece is shorter with an angled kink in the tube, while the longer end is straight. Either end will fit, but we recommend putting the long, straight end of the curved tube into the small connector. The curved tube can also slide up and down to adjust the height, but you want to make sure not to push it down too far or else bubbles will start escaping from the connector. So again, I'll talk about that later when we discuss how to shorten the tube. To attach the airline tubing, remember to line up all of the airline tubing holders so they face the same direction as like the nipple of the air collar. And then the curved end at the top of the uplift tubes, we want to rotate it so it faces away from the airline tubing holders. That way the airline tubing won't get tangled with the curved piece. Connect one end of the airline tubing to the side of the air collar, and then you just snap that airline tubing into the airline tubing holders on the side of the Easy Flow connectors to keep it in place. The other end of the airline tubing is connected to the air pump. So if your air pump is sitting somewhere lower than the top of the fish tank, which it usually is, make sure to install a check valve in the middle of the airline tubing to prevent water from flowing into the airline tubing whenever, the air pump is off or you have a power outage. In order to install the check valve, cut the airline tubing between the sponge filter and the air pump. I usually like to make the cut just a few inches outside of the aquarium. And then attach the check valve in between so that the end of the check valve with the flapper, which kind of looks like a colored or horizontal bar usually, that bar is facing the air pump. If you install the check valve backwards, no worries. You'll just find out that no air will flow through it when you turn on the air pump. So all you have to do is flip around that check valve. Now, when you place the sponge filter in the aquarium, you want the uplift tube to be slightly above the water line. That's going to help maximize your flow. Now, depending on the height of your aquarium, that means you may need to adjust the height of your uplift tube. So first, let me teach you how to shorten the sponge filter. Step 1, remove the short and wide tube that is closest to the sponge filter and the wide connector with no airline tubing holder just above it. Then connect the rest of the EasyFlow parts to the air collar. You want it even shorter? Step 2 is to do the same thing again. Remove the short and wide tube that is closest to the sponge filter and the wide connector with an airline tubing that is just above it. Then reconnect the rest of the EasyFlow parts to the air collar. Still not enough? Step 3, let's use the sliding mechanisms. Push the tall and skinny tube downward so it slides inside the tube closest to the sponge filter. Now the two smaller connectors should be practically touching each other. Also, you can slide down the curved piece as well, but if you push the curved piece all the way down, a gap will form where the connector is, and water and flow will escape from the connector. So the way I do it is go ahead and push the curved piece all the way down, and then you want to pull it back out until it has a snug and tight fit. I measured it, and that means approximately 2.5 inches of the curved piece will be inside the two connectors and the other tube. So if you measure from the bottom of the small connector at the top all the way to the end of the curved piece inside, it's about 2.5 inches. If you have a 5-gallon tank or something even shorter than 10 inches, you may need to make more drastic measures to make it even shorter. And that involves cutting both the short, wide tube and the tall, skinny tube by the same amount. So that means don't cut them to be the same height because you still want the tall, skinny tube to be taller than the short, wide tube when it's all said and done. So for this example, I'm going to lop off 1 inch from both of the straight tubes. Leave the curved piece alone. First, disassemble the EasyFlow accessory and then mark off 1 inch from both of the straight tubes. Now there are two methods I've used to cut the tubes. One is to use a hacksaw with a jig or something to keep it steady. I happen to have a small hobby hacksaw, but the bigger ones with a fine tooth will work too. Just make an initial cut, keep the blade straight as you draw it back and forth, and then keep rotating the tube until it's cut all the way through. Afterwards, you can clean up the edges with a file or sandpaper. The second method is to use a PVC cutter. It leaves a cleaner cut, but you need to make sure that the blade is super sharp because otherwise it will squish the tube and leave stress marks. And we don't want to have any potential gaps where water or bubbles might leak out. And then just reassemble the parts, slide down the tubes as described before, and now you have an even shorter EasyFlow accessory. If you have a super deep aquarium that's 2 feet or taller, you can stack 2 or more sponge filters on top of each other so that the curved uplift tube is still above the water line. You can mix and match different sponge filter sizes, and then if you ever need to set up a quarantine or hospital tank, you can just grab one of those sponges and it's already chock full of beneficial bacteria to help purify the water. So the first step is to remove the uplift tube and the bullseye for the first sponge filter. And then for the second sponge filter you're going to add, we want to remove the bullseye, the weighted base, and the base connector. Take the 2 strainer pieces of the second sponge and then stack them on top of the 2 strainer pieces of the first sponge so that you have 4 strainer pieces connected all together. And then slide the 2 sponges on top of the strainer stack and then add the bullseye and uplift tube. And now you have an even taller sponge filter stack. The final modification you can make to our sponge filter is to run it off a power head instead of an air pump. This is another way to increase the speed of the water current in your aquarium and boost your mechanical filtration, but it does mean you'll have to clean out the sponge more often since it's grabbing particles out of the water more quickly. Now, our Aquarium Co-op power head is designed to fit perfectly with our sponge filters, so just insert one of the shorter, wider uplift tubes directly into the bullseye of the sponge filter. Notice there's no air collar, and then insert the power head into the tube like this. Then, when you plug in the power head, it will suck in water through the sponge and pump out water from the horizontal outlet. If you have any questions, visit our website, aquariumcoop.com, to see the product pages for our sponge filter and easy flow kit. And if you're still running into trouble, please do email our customer support at shipping@aquariumcoop.com. Enjoy Nature Daily!